Good evening to all my legendary lunatics out there. I am your host, Lord Jester Jack, and as always, I've got something very special planned for you. Actually, I've got a serious migraine, throbbing migraine, and I want to go to bed. But instead of going to bed, I'm going to do something even better. I'm going to narrate a story for you guys. I'm going to read one of my favorite creepypastas. It's actually one, back when I was in high school, I was in forensics. And there were a couple times I was signed up for an event that I had not prepared for, and I was told to improvise and make do because we needed someone in that event. And I improvised this piece, this creepypasta. I used to have it memorized back in high school, and I've still got it mostly memorized, but I'm gonna read it to make sure I get it right. But I used to perform this, and I actually got. Usually, I would get. I'd place between like seventh and. One time I got third with it, which is not amazing, but the fact that I was able to use a creepypasta to place, I was very pleased with. So, without further ado, this is the NoEnd House, Part 1. Let me start by saying that Peter Terry was addicted to heroin. We were friends in college and continued to be after I graduated. I noticed that he dropped out after 2 weeks, no, 2 years of barely cutting it. After I moved out of the dorms and into a small apartment, I didn't see Peter much. He would talk online every now and then with me, but AIM was the king of pre-Facebook years. Now, there was a period where he wasn't online for about 5 weeks straight. I wasn't too worried. He was a pretty notorious flake and, at the time, a drug addict. So I assumed he just stopped caring. And then one night, I saw him log on to AIM. Before I could initiate a conversation, he sent me a message. "David, man, we need to talk." And that was when he told me about the NoEnd House. It got that name because no one had ever reached the final exit. The rules were pretty simple and cliche. Reach the final room of a building and you win $500, cash. There were 9 rooms in all. The house was located outside the city, roughly 4 miles from my house. And apparently, Peter had tried and failed. He was a heroin and who knows what the fuck addict, so I figured the drugs got the best of him, and he wigged out after Paper Ghost or something. He told me it would be too much for anyone, and that it was unnatural. Now, I didn't believe him. I told him I would check it out the next night, and no matter how hard he tried to convince me otherwise, $500 just sounded too good to be true. I had to go do it, and I set out the following night. When I arrived, I immediately noticed something strange about the building. Have you ever seen or read something that shouldn't be scary, but for whatever reason, a chill crawls up your spine? I walked towards the building, and the feeling of an uneasiness only intensified as I opened the front door. But my heart slowed as I let out a relieved sigh leave me as I entered. The room looked like a normal hotel lobby decorated for Halloween. A sign was posted in place of a worker. It read, "Room 1 this way. 8 more will follow. Reach the end and you win." I chuckled as I made my way to the first door. Now, the first area was almost laughable. The decor resembled the Halloween aisle in Kmart, complete with sheet ghosts and animatronic zombies that gave a static growl when you passed by. At the far end was an exit, and it was the only door aside from the one I entered through. So I brushed through the fake spider webs and headed to the second room. I was greeted by fog as I opened up the door to room 2. Now, this room definitely upped the ante. In terms of technology, at least. Not only was there a fog machine, but a bat hung from the ceiling and flew in a circle. This was scary. They seemed to have a Halloween soundtrack that one would find in a 99-cent store on loop somewhere in the room. I didn't see a stereo, but I guess they must have used a PA system. I stepped over a few toy rats that wheeled around in circles and walked in with a puffed chest across the room to the next area. I reached for the doorknob and my heart sank to my knees. I did not want to open that door. A feeling of dread hit me so hard I could barely even think. Logic overtook me as, after a few terrifying moments, I shook it off and entered the next room. Room 3 is where things began to change. On the surface, it looked like a normal room. There was a chair in the middle of a wooden panel floor. A single lamp in the corner did a poor job of lighting the area, casting a few shadows across the floor and walls, but that was the problem. Shadows, plural. With the exception of the chairs, there were other shadows. I'd barely walked in when the door, I was already terrified. It was at that moment that I knew something wasn't right. I didn't even think as I automatically tried to open the door I came through, but it was locked from the other side. And that set me off. Was someone locking the doors as I progressed? There was no way. I would have heard them following me. Was it a mechanical lock that set automatically? Well, maybe, but I was too scared to really think. I turned back to the room and the shadows were gone. The chair's shadow remained, but the others were gone. I slowly began to walk across the room, and I used to hallucinate when I was a kid, so I wrote off the shadows as a figment of my imagination. I began to feel better as I made it across the halfway point of the room, but then I looked down, and I took my steps, and that's when I saw it. Or I guess didn't see it. My shadow wasn't there. I didn't have time to scream. I ran as fast as I could to the other door and flung myself into it without thinking. I flung myself through without thinking of the room beyond. And the fourth room was definitely the most disturbing by far. As I closed the door, all light seemed to be sucked out back into the previous room. I stood there, surrounded by darkness, not able to move. I'm not afraid of the dark, mind you, and I never have been, but I was absolutely terrified. All sight had left me. I held my hand in front of my face, and if I didn't know what I was doing, I would never been able to tell it was even there. Darkness doesn't describe what was happening. I couldn't hear anything either. It was dead silent. Like when you're in a soundproof room. Well, even then, you can still hear yourself breathing. You can hear yourself being alive. In room number 4, I couldn't. I began to stumble forward after a few moments, my rapid beating heart the only thing I could feel. There was no door in sight. I wasn't even sure there was one this time. The silence was then broken by a low hum. I felt something behind me. I spun around wildly, but I could barely even see my nose. I knew it was there, though. Regardless of how dark it was, I knew something or someone was there behind me. The hum grew even louder and closer. It seemed to surround me, but I knew whatever was causing the noise was in front of me this time, inching closer and closer. I took a step back. I had never felt the kind of fear I was feeling. I can't really describe true fear. I wasn't even scared I was going to die. I was scared of what the alternative might be. I was afraid of what this thing had in store for me. And then the lights flashed for a second and I saw it. It was nothing. I saw nothing, and I know I saw nothing there. The room was again plunged back into the darkness, and the hum became a wild screech. I screamed in protest. I couldn't hear this goddamn sound for another minute. I ran backwards, away from the noise, and I fumbled for the door handle. I turned it and I fell into room 5. Before I describe room 5, you have to understand something. I am not a drug addict. I've had no history of drug abuse or any sort of psychosis short of the childhood hallucinations I mentioned earlier. Those are only when I was really tired or just waking up. I entered the NoEnd House with a clear head and no substances. After falling in from the previous room, my view of room 5 was from my back, looking up at the ceiling. What I saw didn't scare me, it simply surprised me. Trees had grown into the room and towered above my head. The ceiling in this room was taller than the others. It made me think I was in the center of the house. I got up off the floor and dusted myself off, and took a look around. It was definitely the biggest room of them all. I couldn't even see the door from where I was standing. Various brush and trees must have blocked the line of sight with the exit. Up to this point, I figured the rooms were going to get scarier, but this was a paradise compared to the last 2 rooms. I also assumed whatever was in room 4 stayed back there, but I was incredibly wrong. As I made my way deeper into the room, I began to hear what one would hear if they were in a forest. Chirping bugs and the occasional flap of birds seemed to be my only company in this room. That was the thing that bothered me the most. I heard the bugs and other animals, but I didn't see any of them. I began to wonder how big this house was. From the outside, when I first walked up to it, it looked like a regular house. It was definitely on the bigger side, but this was almost a full forest in here. The canopy covered my view of the ceiling, but I assumed it was still there, however high it was. I couldn't see any walls either on either side of me. The only way I knew I was still inside the house was the floor that matched the other rooms, a standard dark wood paneling. I kept walking, hoping that the next tree I passed would reveal the door. After a few moments of walking, I felt a mosquito fly onto my arm. I shook it off and kept going. A second later, I felt 10 more land on my skin at different places. I felt them crawling up and down my arms and legs, and a few made their way across my face, and I flailed wildly to get them off, but they just kept on crawling. I looked down and let out a muffled scream. More of a whimper, to be honest. I couldn't see a single bug. Not one bug was on me, but I could feel them crawling. I heard them fly off my face and sting my skin, but I couldn't see a single one. I dropped to the ground and began to roll around wildly. I was desperate. I hated bugs, especially ones I couldn't see or touch. But these bugs could touch me, and they were everywhere. I began to crawl. I had no idea where I was going. The entrance was nowhere in sight, and I still hadn't even seen the exit. So I just crawled. My skin wriggled with the presence of those phantom bugs. After what seemed like hours, I found the door. I grabbed the nearest tree and propped myself up, mindlessly slapping my arms and legs to no avail. I tried to run, but I couldn't. My body was exhausted from crawling and smacking and scratching and dealing with whatever the hell was on me. I took a few shaky steps towards the door and grabbed each tree on the way for support. It was only a few feet away when I heard it. The low hum from before. It was coming from the next room, and it was deeper. I could almost feel it inside my body, like when you stand next to an amp at a concert. The feeling of bugs on me lessened as the hum grew louder. As I placed my hand on the doorknob, the bugs were completely gone, but I couldn't bring myself to turn that knob. I knew that if I let go, the bugs would return, and there was no way I could make it. There was no way I could make it back to room 4. I just stood there, my head pressed against the door marked number 6, my hand shakily grasping the knob, the hum so loud I couldn't even hear myself pretend to think. There was nothing I could do but move on. Room 6 was next. Room 6 was hell. like this one. Closed the door behind me, my eyes held shut and my ears ringing. The hum was surrounding me. As the door clicked into place, the hum was gone. I opened my eyes in surprise, and the door I had shut was gone. It was just a wall now. I looked around in shock. The room was identical to room 3, the same chair and lamp, but this time with the correct amount of shadows. The only real difference was that there was no exit door, and the one I came through was gone now too. As I said before, I had no previous issue in terms of mental instability, but at this moment I fell into what I now know was insanity. I didn't scream. I didn't make a sound. At first I scratched softly. The wall was tough, but I knew the door was there somewhere. I just knew it was. It had to be. I scratched to where the doorknob was. I clawed at the wall frantically with both hands, my nails being filed down to the skin against the wood. I fell silently to my knees, the only sound in the room, the incessant scratching against the wall. I knew it was there. The door was there. It had to be. I knew it was there. I knew it just was there. I knew if I could just get past this wall. Are you all right? I jumped off the ground and spun around in motion. I leaned against the wall behind me, and I saw what it was that spoke to me. And to this day, I regret ever turning around. There was a little girl. She was wearing a soft, white dress that went down to her knees. She had long blonde hair to the middle of her back and white skin and blue eyes. And she was the most frightening thing I'd ever seen. And I know that nothing in my life will ever be as unnerving as what I saw in her. While looking at her, I saw something else. Where she stood, I saw what looked like a man's body, only larger than normal and covered in hair. And he was naked from head to toe, but his head was not human, and his feet were hooves. It wasn't the devil, but at that moment he might as well have been. The form had the head of a ram and the snout of a wolf. It was horrifying, and it was synonymous with the little girl in front of me. They were the same form. I can't really describe it, but I saw them at the same time. They shared the same space in the room. It was like looking in two separate dimensions. When I saw the girl, I saw the form, and when I saw the form, I saw the girl. I couldn't speak. I could barely even see. My mind was revolting against what it was attempting to process. I'd been scared before in my life, and I had never been more scared than I was when I was trapped in the 4th room, but that was before room 6. I just stood there, staring at whatever it was that spoke to me. There was no exit. I was trapped here, and then it spoke again. It said, "David, you should have listened." When it spoke, I heard the words of the little girl, but the other form spoke through the mind in a voice that I won't even attempt to describe. There was no other sound. The voice just kept repeating that sentence over and over in my mind, and I agreed. I didn't know what to do. I was slipping into madness. I couldn't take my eyes off of what was in front of me. I dropped to the floor. I thought I'd passed out, but the room wouldn't let me. I just wanted it to end. I was on my side, my eyes wide open and the form staring down at me. scurrying across the floor in front of me was one of the battery-powered rats from the second room. The house was toying with me. But for some reason, seeing that rat pulled my mind back from whatever depths it was headed, and I looked around the room. I was getting out of here. I was determined to get out of that house and live and never think about this place ever again. I knew this room was hell, and I wasn't ready to take up residency here. At first, it was just my eyes that moved. I searched the walls for any kind of opening. The room wasn't that big, so it didn't take long for me to soak up the entire layout. The demon still taunted me. The voice grew louder as the form stayed rooted where it stood. I placed my hand on the floor, lifted myself up on all fours, and turned to scan the wall behind me. And I saw something I couldn't believe. The form was now right at my back, whispering into my mind how I shouldn't have come. I felt its breath on the back of my neck, but I refused to turn around. A large rectangle was scratched into the wood, with a small dent chipped away at the center of it. Right in front of my eyes, I saw the large 7 I had mindlessly scratched into the wall. I knew what it was. Room 7 was just beyond this wall, where room 5 was moments ago. I don't know how I had done it. Maybe it was just my state of mind at the time, but I had created the door. I knew I had. In my madness, I had scratched into the wall that I needed the most. An exit to the next room. Room 7 was close. I knew the demon was right behind me, but for some reason, it couldn't touch me. I closed my eyes and placed both hands on the large 7 in front of me, and I pushed. I pushed as hard as I could. The demon was now screaming in my ear. It told me I was never leaving. It told me that this was the end, but I wasn't going to die. I was going to live there in room 6 with it, but I wasn't. I pushed and I screamed at the top of my lungs. I knew I was going to push through the wall eventually. I clenched my eyes shut and I screamed, and the demon was gone. And I was left in silence. I turned around slowly and was greeted by the room as it was when I entered. Just a chair and a lamp. I couldn't believe it, but I didn't have time. I turned around to see the 7 and jumped back slightly. What I saw was a door. It wasn't the one I had scratched in, but a regular door with a large 7 on it. My whole body was shaking. It took me a while to turn the knob. I just stood there for a while, staring at the door. I couldn't stay in room 6. I couldn't, but if this was only room 6, I couldn't imagine what room 7 had in store. Finally, with a deep breath, I twisted the knob and opened the door to room 7. I stumbled through the door, mentally exhausted and physically weak. The door behind me closed, and I realized where I was. I was outside. Not outside room 5, but actually outside. My eyes stung, and I wanted to cry. I fell to my knees, and I tried, but I couldn't. I was finally out of this hell. I didn't even care about the prize that I was promised. I turned and I saw the door I went through, and it was the entrance. I walked to the car and I drove home, thinking of how nice that a shower sounded right now. As I pulled up to my house, I felt uneasy. The joy of leaving the NoEnd House had faded, and dread was slowly building in my stomach. I shook it off as residual from the house and made my way up to the front door. I entered and immediately went up to my room. There on my bed was my cat, Baskerville. He was the first living thing I'd seen all night, and I reached out to pet him. and he hissed and swiped at my hand. I recoiled in shock, as he'd never acted like that. I thought, whatever, he's an old cat. I jumped in the shower and got ready for what I was expecting to be a sleepless night. After my shower, I went to the kitchen to make something to eat, and I descended the stairs, turned into my family room. What I saw will be burned into my mind forever. My parents were lying on the ground, naked and covered in blood. They were mutilated to near unidentifiable states. Their limbs were removed and placed next to the bodies, and their heads were placed on their chests, facing me. The most unsettling part was their expressions. They were smiling. Smiling as though they were happy to see me. I vomited and sobbed there in the family room. I didn't know what had happened. They didn't even live with me at the time. I was a mess. And then I saw it. A door that was never there before. A door with a large 8 scrawled on it in blood on the other side of the family room. I was still in the house. I was standing in my family room, but I was in room 7. The faces of my parents smiled wider as I realized this. They weren't my parents. They couldn't be, but they looked exactly like them. The door marked 8 was across the room, behind the mutilated bodies in front of me that resembled my parents. I knew I had to move on, but at that moment I gave up. The smiling faces tore into my mind. They grounded me where I stood. I vomited again and again, and I nearly collapsed. And then the hum returned. It was louder than ever, and it filled the house and shook the walls. The hum compelled me to walk. I began to walk slowly, making my way closer to the door and the bodies. I could barely stand, let alone walk, and the closer I got to my parents, the closer I became to suicide. The walls were now shaking so hard it seemed as though they were going to crumble, but still, the faces smiled at me. As I inched closer, their eyes followed me. I was now between the 2 bodies, a few feet away from the door. The dismembered hands clawed their way towards the carpet, towards me. All the while, the faces continued to stare and smile. New terror washed over me, and I walked faster. I didn't want to hear them speak. I didn't want their voices to match those of my parents. They began to open their mouths, and their hands were inches from my feet. In a dash of desperation, I lunged for the door and threw it open and slammed it behind me. Room number 8. I was done. After what I'd experienced, I knew there wasn't anything else in this fucking house that it could throw at me that I couldn't live through. There was nothing short of hell, the fires of hell, that I wasn't ready for. Unfortunately, I underestimated the abilities of the NoEnd House. Unfortunately, things got more disturbing, more terrifying, and more unspeakable in room 8. I still have trouble believing what I saw in room 8. Again, the room was a carbon copy of rooms 6 and 3. But sitting in the usually empty chair was a man. And after a few seconds of disbelief, my mind finally accepted the fact that the man sitting in the chair was me. Not someone who looked like me. It was David Williams. I walked closer. I had to get a better look, even though I was sure that it was me. He looked up at me, and I noticed tears in his eyes. "Please, please don't do it. Please don't hurt me," he said. "What?" I asked. "Who are you? I'm not going to hurt you." "Yes, you are." He was sobbing now. "You're going to hurt me, and I don't want you to." He sat in the chair with his legs up, tucked into his chest, and began rocking back and forth. It was pretty pathetic looking, especially since he was me, identical in every way. "Listen, who are you?" I was now only a few feet from him, from my doppelganger. It was the weirdest experience yet, standing there talking to myself. I wasn't scared, but I would be soon. "Why are you... You're going to hurt me! You're going to hurt me if you want to leave. If you want to leave, you're going to hurt me." "Why are you saying this? Just calm down, all right? Let's try and figure this..." And then I saw it. The David sitting down was wearing the same clothes as me, except for a small red patch on his shirt embroidered with the number 9. "You're going to hurt me," he said. "You're going to hurt me if you want to leave. Just please don't hurt me." I didn't leave that small number on his chest. I knew exactly what it was. But the first few doors were plain and simple, just a door, but after a while they got a little more ambiguous. Door 7 was scratched into the wall by my own hands. 8 was marked in blood above the bodies of my parents, but 9, the number 9, it was on a person, a living person. Worse still, it was on a person that looked exactly like me. "David?" I had to ask. "Yes, you're going to hurt me. You're going to hurt me." He continued to sob and rock back and forth. He answered to David. He was me, right down to the voice, to the name. But that 9... The room had no other door, as he sobbed back in his chair. Similar to room 6, the door I came through was gone. For some reason, I assumed that scratching would get me nowhere this time. I studied the walls and the floor around the chair, sticking my head underneath to see if anything was below, and unfortunately, there was. Below the chair was a knife. Attached was a tag that read, "To David, from management." The feeling in my stomach as I read that tag was something sinister. I wanted to throw up. The last thing I wanted to do was remove that knife from under the chair. The other David was still sobbing uncontrollably. My mind was spinning into the attic of the unanswerable questions. Who put this here? And how did they get my name? Not to mention the fact that as I knelt on the cold wooden floor, I also sat in that chair, sobbing in protest of being hurt by myself. It was all too much to process. The house and the management had been playing with me the whole time. My thoughts, for some reason, turned to Peter and whether or not he got this far. If he did, if he met a Peter Terry sobbing in his very chair, rocking back and forth. I shook these thoughts out of my head. They didn't matter. I took the knife from under the chair, and immediately the other David went quiet. "David, he said in my voice. What do you think you're going to do? I lifted myself from the ground and clenched the knife in my hand. I'm going to get out of here. David was still sitting in the chair, though he was very calm now. He looked up at me with a slight grin. I couldn't tell if he was going to laugh or strangle me. Slowly he got up from the chair and stood, facing me. It was uncanny. His height, and even the way he stood, matched mine. I felt the rubber hilt of the knife in my hand and gripped it tighter. I don't know what I was planning on doing with it, but I had a feeling I was going to need it. No. His voice was slightly deeper than my own now. I'm going to hurt you. I'm going to hurt you, and I'm going to keep you here. I didn't respond. I just lunged and tackled him to the ground. I had mounted him and took him down. I looked down, the knife poised and ready. He looked up at me terrified. It was like I was looking in a mirror. And then the hum returned, low and distant. I felt it deep in my body. The other David looked up at me as I looked down at myself. The hum was growing louder, and I felt something inside of me snap. In one motion, I slammed the knife down into the patch on his chest and ripped down. Blackness fell on the room, and I was falling. The darkness around me was like nothing I'd experienced up to that point. Room 4 was dark, but it didn't come close to what I was completely engulfed in now. I wasn't even sure if I was falling after a while. I felt weightless, covered in the dark. Then a deep sadness came over me. I felt lost, depressed, and finally, suicidal. The sight of my parents entered my mind again. I knew it wasn't real, but I had seen it, and the mind was having trouble differentiating between what was real and what wasn't. The sadness only deepened. I was in room 9 for what seemed like days, the final room. And that's exactly what it was. The end. The NoEnd House had an end, and I had reached it. At that moment, I gave up. I knew I would be in that in-between state forever, accompanied by nothing but darkness. Not even the hum was there to keep me sane. I had lost all senses. I couldn't feel myself. I couldn't hear anything. Sight was completely useless here. I searched for a taste in my mouth, and I found nothing. I felt disembodied and completely lost. But I knew where I was. This was hell. Room 9 was hell. Then it happened. A light. One of those stereotypical lights at the end of the tunnel. I felt ground come up from below me, and I was standing suddenly. And after a moment or two, I gathered my thoughts and senses and slowly walked towards that light. As I approached the light, it took form. It was a vertical slit down the side of an unmarked door. I slowly walked through the door and found myself back where I started. The lobby of the NoEnd House. It was exactly how I left it. Still empty, still decorated with childish Halloween decor, but after everything that had happened that night, I was still wary that I was where I was. After a few moments of normalcy, I looked around the place trying to find anything different. On the desk was a plain white envelope with my name handwritten on it. Immensely curious, yet still cautious, I mustered up the courage to open the envelope. And inside was a letter, again handwritten. David Williams, congratulations. You have made it to the end of the NoEnd House. Please accept this prize as a token of a great achievement. Forever yours, Management. With the letter were 5 $100 bills. And I couldn't stop laughing. I laughed for what seemed like hours. I laughed as I walked from the door to my car, and I laughed as I drove home. I laughed as I pulled into my driveway. I laughed as I opened my front door to my house. And I laughed. And I laughed. I laughed as I saw the door across from me with a small 10 etched into the wood. And that is the end of the NoEnd House Part 1. I want to thank you all so much for listening in today. That is one of my favorite scary stories to read, and I'll probably do another reading at some point once I've got my technical setup better done. Once I get all the technical stuff figured out, I'll probably start adding the music in post so it lines up a little bit better and I'm not fiddling with it the whole time. But I think today's story went really well. If you have any more requests, any other scary stories I can read, let me know. Thank you guys so much for watching again. Remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what you think. If you have any comments about this. And I look forward to hearing from you. As always, remember to sit back, relax, and enjoy the darkness around you, because if you don't, then you're not really living life to the fullest, are you? I love you guys so much. Thank you for everything you do, and I will see you next time. Have a great night.